Hi, I'm Ed. Welcome to Common Sense.
And I'm John. How are you doing, Ed?
I'm good, John. How about you?
I'm doing great.
You guys are baking in Houston, I think, like the rest of the country this week.
Oh yeah, we're used to it. The barbecue was invented here because people just had meat around and it just started cooking.
Well, we're baking up here near Boston, but we're not quite as used to it as you are.
All right. Well, today's topic is complex sales, and we've talked about this before, and we're talking about it in our new book that's about to come out. But I think the thing is that it's never been easy to sell $1 million piece of equipment or a long-term services contract, but it does seem harder than ever. And we're going to talk about what that gut feeling is about and put some numbers to it and then try to dive into why this is happening. So from the numbers, if you look at, there's a 2014 CEB Gartner, I guess it was a survey that said that buying teams were typically 5.4 members or so back then, and now that number's up to almost 7. So that's in 4 years, that's a pretty dramatic increase. And now, what that means is we have to reach and convince more buyers for any complex sale. And let's face it, it's not getting easier to reach people. It's getting harder because there's more competition and so on. So those teams are more likely to come up with no decision because we can't reach them in the first place or because they're so complex and they have other influences. So it's much more difficult to get a purchase decision. And so what can we do about that?
Yeah, I think that it may be even worse than those statistics that you cited. The 6.8 or 7 number was, I think, from 2016. And so we've gone almost another 2 years since then. And who knows, maybe it's gone up another 20 or 30%. But you make the point it was never easy. But there used to be, we could talk to a decision maker. That was kind of one of those basic sales blocking and tackling things. Who makes the decision? Who writes the checks? Who sets the budget? Who expects other people to make it happen? And we've always been trained as salespeople. We need to identify that person, cultivate that relationship. And if you even look at most of the sales training and qualification methods, that's one of the important criteria. You can't, close the door in a Sandler submarine. You can't advance in whatever sales model you're using unless you know who the decision maker is. And while it's easy to say there's no longer a decision maker, obviously that's a cop-out. Somebody is ultimately in charge. There's a CEO, there's a president. But the real question is anybody willing to exercise that authority anymore? And increasingly, I think the answer is no. And so that means although there is a decision maker, in practice, there often isn't, because more and more decisions end up being made by consensus. These senior managers just aren't willing to have the argument. Long term, I think that's got disastrous consequences for business. There's silos, there's personal preference, and all of these things become a substitute in the kind of the political wrangling within companies and these complex buying teams. They substitute for actual, prudent, proactive, rigorous business execution. And it's not necessarily the right thing for the business, but until senior managers are willing to kind of step back in, take the authority, take the heat rounds that they'll take for making the decisions, that's where we are, as best I can see. How do you see it at play?
Well, I think if you look at the team dynamics, drill down a little bit, typically even, this hasn't really changed, but you have one or more advocates that's got a problem. He's looking for a solution or she's looking for a solution. And that's what we've been calling the champion, the purchase champion. So that person is still there, and typically they're the ones that start the conversation on the buyer end. And so that we've talked before about how they use more and more digital channels to try to find those solutions, and you have to be out there to be found. But the other members of the team are typically representatives of the other stakeholders in the business. So it could be departments like IT or health and safety, R&D, purchasing, logistics, transportation, and legal. Those are typically all members of the team.
Right.
And they're all very diverse. So they have different interests, they have different agendas, different points of view. And, you can see how it would be difficult to reach a consensus, even within the team, and then let alone convince the decision maker or the chairman of the buying team to go ahead and make that decision. So with all that confusion and all those different appetites and needs and all that sort of thing, what can salespeople do about that?
So obviously they need to step up their game, and we all need to be honest about it. We need to look at pipelines, and sales management needs to hold people accountable as sales cycles become protracted, as more deals go to no decision, as you get this big bulge around quoting. Let's be very honest and frank about what's going on here so that we can begin to address it. And as sales reps say, you know what, it's a crummy situation, it's a crazy world, nevertheless we have to figure out how to deal with it. Then they need to think about how they can improve their game. And I think that, DISC and Whole Brain offer really interesting ways for salespeople to understand how they are comfortable acting and how they interact with buyers, but also how to understand how buyers are thinking. So the IT and the HR members of those buying teams will look at the world very differently. And the sales rep in a complex sales situation has to figure out how to adapt and empathize and speak to each of them. They need a toolkit to do that, not just flying blind. For a long time, people have called sales reps sales consultants, and that consultant was kind of, it was just a goofy title on a business card. But increasingly in complex sales, salespeople really do need to be business consultants. In essence, they may be selling a welded piece of machinery with a PLC in it, but what they're really doing is selling a consulting service. They could be delivering a binder with outcomes as opposed to the machine. In many ways, that's the same kind of thing they're doing. Bob Apollo is a guy that we've mentioned as a resource in some of our conversations before, and he does a great job with statistics. In fact, he's got one that just always sticks with me. Buyers are 4 times as interested in the insights about how to improve their business as they are in product info. And sadly, that inversely correlates with salespeople that are 4 times more comfortable and more inclined to talk about products than they are about the business issues. And so you got to find people that can really understand business and serve as consultants. They need to get serious about collaborating with their marketing colleagues, because they got to create tools and techniques and content and sales enablement and scripts and templates and all those kinds of things that will allow them to sell virtually and effectively, often through the champion, to these different interests. So, the simple ROI that may make sense to the manufacturing engineer is not going to be viewed very favorably by the finance department. So there's got to be, a more robust set of tools for the finance department that gets created that salespeople can pass along to help sell, because they're not going to talk to a finance person personally. They're going to have to do it through that champion. Videos and other kinds of tools that will address the way that people in different departments like to process information are as important as the content itself. And so you got to make sure that sales enablement is properly delivered. And you're not going to get to that whole team. That's the bottom line. No matter how much somebody wants to jump up and down and stomp their feet and say you get to the decision maker, it's not going to happen. So other tools like analytics and marketing automation, even buyer intent data, that will let you kind of tease some information where the champion may be doing their best to relay back to you what's really happening on the team, but they're biased as well. And so they're not necessarily going to be able to give you fully kind of actionable information. So some of these other tools will let you see who else in the company is researching, who else in the company is talking to competitors, who else in the company has been on your site that you didn't even realize was part of the decision-making process. Those kinds of tools will become really important to try to put together this intelligence, this full 360-degree intelligence perspective that buyers are going to need. But kind of underlying all of this, and perhaps one of the biggest challenges in the industrial space, is that companies need to shift their thinking, and not about the product or service they're selling, but about the business issues they solve. And that's a lot more complicated than it sounds. I mean, it's a no-brainer. It's easy to say it, but it's amazing how many great companies with long histories and strong lists of customers and references that I talk to that just have never stopped to step back and say, okay, this is a feature, but why does that matter? And take it another level. Why is that important? Kind of go down through those 5 levels of questioning, keeping asking why. And finally, what does it cost if we don't have this? I mean, what's the implication if we don't have this? Without doing that, you're really lost. I think that another thing that companies can do is to pull in internally, as you develop that sales enablement collateral, pull people from those disciplines within their company. So bring your own HR person in, bring your own finance person in, bring your own IT person in, because they'll be more fluent in the language that those members of your prospects complex buying team are using. It'll help you create the right kind of sales enablement content. So you flipped my switch, and I had a long list there. What would you add to it?
Good list. No, you made a lot of great points. I think, we do have to try to get inside the heads of everybody on the buying team, but it's really difficult to do that. So we may not be able to reach all of them directly, but you mentioned some of the ways we can reach them indirectly. And we need to think about both of those things in a coordinated program. So it's very difficult from a marketing point of view to do this sort of thing with a single focused sales and marketing approach. You can't just run campaigns like we used to do and put out blogs. So it really requires a much more customized buyer experience for each member of the buying team. And that implies that you have to get to know them well, one way or another. So you have to do your research. Your buyer intent data would help with that. Just taking an example, the safety officer, for example, doesn't care much about product efficiency or cost savings. So they want to talk about safety and training and minimizing lost hours.
Right.
So you've got to customize your content, your outreach, even the people that talk to these people, if they ever get there, have some expertise in these areas and are able to answer those questions.
Right.
And one way to do that is account-based marketing, which is really what we're talking about. It's really identifying a client or a customer that you want to work with, and identifying everyone that's on the buying team, and then really focusing on each one of those and customizing every communication you have with them to make it as relevant and valuable as possible. So I think you're seeing much more of that, and a lot more companies that sell capital equipment or whatever are starting to go with that strategy. And this also means that the customer experience, everything that they touch along the journey, is customized for them. So you really need to think about your website and how that works for each member of the buying team, and how easy is it for them to get the information they need to make a sensible decision. And then even talking about sort of the meta topics, why is this going to help your company as a whole? And how do your individual pieces of that, your responsibilities, fit into that puzzle? So you have to look at it from, a higher up point of view as well. And so it's complicated. It takes a lot of effort. And it probably doesn't mean we're reducing sales cycles. It could mean we're increasing them. But we have a much higher chance of success because what we're talking to these customers or buyers about is really what they need and what they want to hear.
Right.
So, this is really what we're talking about in our new book, Common Sense Revenue Growth, which should be coming out in the next couple of weeks. And, it's all about talking to CEOs about what's going on in their organizations. Why are they not making these decisions? What's happening to make it difficult to keep growing, as a company? And a lot of that has to do with the way you sell, the way you market, and the way you support customers. So we're talking about, massive change in some cases. Others, maybe not so much. So what kinds of things could sales and marketing teams do? It might take years to really turn around or transform your company into a digital sales dynamo, but what could you do in the meantime to sort of improve on things?
I think the key is the small steps. I mean, to just start moving, as the expression goes, how do you eat an elephant one bite at a time? Mm-hmm. I mean, companies just have to start to make the change, and what girds all of it ultimately is the CEO's leadership and emphasis of the importance of the customer. There was an article in Wall Street Journal today about key airlines and whether the CEOs ever sit in economy class seats. United CEO refused to participate. Americans did and had a bunch of excuses. And Delta said that every time he flies domestically, he flies in coach. And I think that, it's up to, and that's reflected in my experience with each of those airlines recently. It's up to the CEO to live the change that they're articulating and to really understand and solve for the buyer. And in every meeting, make sure, who is the buyer advocate? How is this important to the buyer, not just satisfying some selfish interests that we have? It's, there's a real opportunity cost. Most companies are busy right now, so they're not worried about a slowdown and failing, but there's an opportunity cost in missed opportunity. So, we kind of started this discussion without adversarial positions, as we often do. It was more a discussion than a debate. I think we both agreed from the outset that complex sales are much harder today than they were just a few years ago, and that's certainly been my experience. I think that the data backs it up.
Yeah, I certainly agree with you, and I do think that complex sales are harder because the traditional sales methods are failing.
Right.
And, buying teams are getting bigger and more diverse in their demands. And as we've said, business leaders are becoming more likely to manage by committee and apparently more comfortable with the status quo. So with our book, we're trying to shake them up a little bit, get them out of that thinking and help them understand why they should. It's not really something that you can just plug in some technology or do a little coaching to get around. It's going to take strong leadership and a willingness to change. So if you're interested, as I mentioned before, we have a book coming out, and we're going to keep going with our Common Sense series. So we'll see you next time. I'm John.
And I'm Ed. Thanks for joining us.